41,799. That is the number that appeared on a computer screen inside a Harvard genetics lab, and for a moment, nobody in the room said a word. On that screen sat the genetic fingerprint of 27 people who had been buried without names, without paperwork, without a single document proving they had ever existed at all. And in that silence, a team of scientists realized they were looking at bloodlines that slavery was supposed to have erased forever. This is not a story about a famous person. It is a story about 27 anonymous graves in the woods of Maryland, and about a piece of technology that was never designed to work on them. For 200 years, the official record said their identities were gone, burned, buried, or simply never written down in the first place. That was the accepted version of events for generations of historians, genealogists, and families searching for a starting point that never seemed to exist. Today, you are not a viewer. You are the investigator. You are going to walk through this case exactly the way the scientists did, one layer of evidence at a time, in the order it was actually uncovered: the bones, the method, the origin, the living relatives, and finally, the reason none of this was supposed to be findable in the first place. Stay with the evidence because the order matters, and by the end, you may understand why some historians are calling this one of the most significant genetic discoveries in the history of African American research. Before we go further, if you already know a family story about an ancestor whose trail goes cold before the 1870s, drop it in the comments. You may recognize more of this case than you expect. Let's start where the investigation actually started, not in a lab, but in the dirt. In 1979, road crews working for the Maryland State Highway Administration were surveying land near Catoctin Mountain in Frederick County, Maryland, ahead of a planned roadway. Standard procedure, nothing unusual expected. Then, the survey turned up something the planners had not accounted for: unmarked human graves. Dozens of them, arranged in the quiet, deliberate rows of a cemetery that no map had recorded. Archaeologists were called in, the remains were carefully documented, and the state eventually transferred them to the Smithsonian Institution for long-term study and safekeeping. What the historical paperwork could tell them was limited, but it was not nothing. Catoctin Furnace had been an ironworks, one of the industrial engines of early America. Founded in the 1770s, it produced pig iron, tools, and munitions. During the Revolutionary War, the furnace even supplied ammunition to the Continental Army. In 1780 alone, it delivered more than 10 tons of 10-inch bombshells, some of which are believed to have been used the following year at the Battle of Yorktown, the battle that effectively ended the war. None of that iron came out of the ground and into cannonballs by itself. It came out through the forced labor of enslaved African Americans, along with an unknown number of free black laborers, working as colliers who turned wood into charcoal, as teamsters who hauled ore and fuel, and fillers who fed the raw materials into the furnace itself, day and night, in brutal heat. Historical estimates suggest more than 270 enslaved people labored at Catoctin Furnace over its operating history. The 27 individuals whose remains were eventually chosen for the genetic study we're building toward held only a fraction of them. 27 individuals whose remains were eventually chosen for the genetic study we're building toward. Here's the problem that every historian and genealogist ran into, decade after decade. None of these 27 people had names attached to their graves. No headstones, no ledger entries, no baptismal records connecting a name to a body. This is not unusual, it's the norm. The overwhelming majority of enslaved African Americans vanish from the written record entirely before 1870, the first United States Census to list Black Americans by their own names rather than as property counted alongside livestock and furniture. Genealogists call this the 1870 brick wall, and for most African American families, it is exactly that, a wall. Historian and Harvard scholar Henry Louis Gates, Jr., who has spent decades helping people trace African American ancestry on television and in print, has described this gap as one of the deepest unresolved mysteries in American history, a void where millions of family trees simply stop mid-branch with no way forward. So that was the state of the case for over 40 years after the 1979 discovery. 27 sets of bones, a rich record of the furnace's industrial output, and almost nothing about who these individual human beings actually were, where their families came from, or whether anyone alive today was even distantly connected to them. That is the starting point. Now ask yourself the question the researchers had to ask. Is there any way to identify a person who left behind no name, no document, and no photograph, using nothing but what remains in their skeleton? Quick gut check before we move to the science. Before you knew this story existed, would you have guessed that DNA could answer a question written records completely failed to answer? Say yes or no in the comments. It matters for what's coming. Here is where most people assume the answer is simple. Just extract DNA from old bones, like on a crime show, and read it. It is not that simple, and in this particular case, it should not have worked at all. DNA is a fragile molecule. Over time, it breaks down, chemically, physically, biologically, and the two biggest enemies of ancient DNA are heat and moisture. Maryland is hot and humid for much of the year. The soil at Catoctin Furnace is exactly the kind of environment that ancient DNA researchers consider close to a worst-case scenario for preservation. Compare that to the frozen permafrost of Siberia, or the cold, dry caves of Europe, where some of the most famous ancient DNA recoveries in history, including DNA tens of thousands of years old from extinct human relatives, have come from remains preserved by consistent cold. Catoctin Furnace offered none of those advantages. These remains had spent roughly 2 centuries in warm, wet, acidic ground, conditions that typically shred DNA into fragments too short and too damaged to be useful. This is the technical wall the research team had to break through. The project was led by David Reich, a professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School's Blatnick Institute, and one of the most prominent ancient DNA researchers in the world. His lab had spent years developing techniques originally built for recovering genetic material from remains tens of thousands of years old in far harsher preservation conditions than most historical American cemeteries. The first author on the resulting study, Aidan Harney, working with Reich Lab and with the consumer genetics company 23andMe, applied those extreme case methods to a much more recent, but chemically much more degraded set of remains. The team also partnered with Smithsonian physical anthropologists, including Corinne Bruelheide and Douglas Owsley, who had cared for and studied the Catoctin skeletal remains for years. Instead of trying to extract DNA from just any bone, the researchers targeted the petrous bone, a small, extremely dense structure located at the base of the skull near the inner ear. It turns out this is one of the most protective vaults in the entire human skeleton. Its density shields DNA from some of the degradation that destroys genetic material elsewhere in the body, even after centuries underground. Using a minimally invasive drilling technique, the team was able to access this bone without significantly damaging the rest of the skull, respecting the remains while extracting the genetic material locked inside. But dense bone alone was not enough. Even from the petrous bone, what came out was a genome full of gaps, broken, incomplete, missing huge stretches of information. This is where a second technique came in: imputation. In simple terms, imputation uses the fragments of DNA that are readable, combined with enormous reference databases of complete human genomes, to statistically reconstruct the missing sections with a high degree of confidence, essentially filling in a puzzle using the shape of the pieces you do have and the pattern of millions of other completed puzzles. It's a method more commonly associated with genomes tens of thousands of years old. Applying it here to fill in gaps from remains only 2 centuries old but badly degraded by Maryland's climate was itself a notable technical choice. Piece by piece, gap by gap, the team assembled workable genetic profiles for these individuals in this cemetery, people who, by most conventional expectations, should not have yielded usable DNA at all. The result, published in the journal Science on August 4, 2023, gave researchers something no ledger, no deed, and no plantation record had ever provided: a direct genetic signature, straight from the bone, for 27 specific, individual human beings. At this point, the team had genetic data, but data alone doesn't tell you where someone's ancestors came from. It has to be compared against something. And this is where the investigation takes its first major turn. With workable genomes finally in hand, the researchers turned to comparison, matching the genetic segments recovered from the Catoctin individuals against large reference datasets representing populations from West Africa, Central Africa, and Europe. This is not guesswork. It is pattern matching at enormous scale, looking for which present-day population groups share the highest concentration of specific identifiable genetic segments with each historical individual. And the pattern that emerged was consistent and specific. Among the Catoctin individuals with detectable African ancestry, the strongest genetic connections pointed to 2 groups in particular: the Wolof and Mandinka peoples of the Senegal region in West Africa, and the Congo peoples of Central Africa. Not West Africa in some vague continent-wide sense, but specific ethno-linguistic populations with names, with known homelands, with documented cultures and histories that long predate the Atlantic slave trade. Here's why that specificity matters. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, a decades-long academic project cataloging tens of thousands of individual slave ship voyages, shows that roughly a quarter of all enslaved Africans forcibly transported to what became the United States were taken from the Senegal region, and another quarter from the Congo-Angola region of Central Africa. The DNA extracted from these 27 anonymous graves in Maryland lined up almost precisely with the 2 largest documented source regions of the entire American slave trade. In other words, the bones weren't just confirming that these individuals were of African descent, something already visually apparent to the archaeologists in 1979. They were pointing to the 2 specific corners of an entire continent that their direct ancestors most likely called home generations before the Atlantic crossing. The study also found something else, something harder to sit with. Many of the individuals carried European ancestry as well, primarily traceable to Great Britain and Ireland, and that ancestry showed up disproportionately on the paternal line, inherited through father-to-son genetic markers rather than evenly across the family tree. Historians studying the broader pattern of African American ancestry have long documented why that specific lopsided pattern exists. It reflects a well-established and difficult truth about the power imbalances built into the institution of slavery itself, where enslaved women had little to no ability to refuse relationships with the men who held legal power over their lives. The researchers presented this finding plainly, without sensationalizing it, because the genetic evidence simply confirmed what historical scholarship on slavery had already established through other sources. So now the case has a location. 2 locations, actually, one in Senegambia, one in Central Africa, plus a documented, if uncomfortable, layer of European ancestry. But a place of origin is only half of an identity. The other half is, does anyone connected to these 27 people still exist right now, walking around, completely unaware? That question is where the investigation produced its most staggering number yet. If you had to guess right now, before I tell you, how many living relatives do you think a database search like this could actually find? Type your guess in the comments before the next section. Most people are wrong by a factor of 10. Here is how you go from "these are the origins of 27 historical people" to "these are their living relatives today by name and location." And this step is arguably the most technically inventive part of the entire study. 23andMe, the consumer genetics company, maintains one of the largest privately held human genome databases on the planet, built from millions of customers who voluntarily submitted DNA samples for Ancestry and health testing. A significant number of those customers have also opted in to participate in scientific research, meaning their anonymized genetic data can be used under strict ethical review to help answer exactly this kind of question. The research team used a method called identical by descent matching, or IBD matching, a technique that identifies shared segments of DNA between two people that are so specific and so long that they could only have come from a shared, relatively recent common ancestor, rather than just general population-level similarity. Applying that method, the team compared the genetic profiles of the 27 Catoctin individuals against the consenting research participants in 23andMe. The result? 41,799 living people, right now in the United States, carry a detectable, verifiable genetic connection to these 27 people who were buried without names in a Maryland cemetery. Let that number sit for a second, because it deserves to. 41,799 confirmed genetic relatives, identified from a population that historical records had completely failed to document. The researchers were careful about interpreting this number responsibly. The vast majority of these connections are distant. Many trace back not to a direct parent-child line, but to a shared ancestor who may have lived in Africa or Europe even before the individuals came to Catoctin Furnace at all. But a smaller, more tightly connected subset showed much closer genetic ties, closer than would be expected by chance, consistent with people separated from the historical individuals by only about 5 to 6 generations, roughly a century and a half. And when the researchers mapped where these closer relatives live today, one location stood out above every other state in the country: Maryland. The same state, the same region in many cases, meaning that in all likelihood there are people living within driving distance of Catoctin Furnace right now who are direct genetic descendants of the enslaved workers who once built cannon shells for George Washington's army and who have absolutely no idea. The research team, aware of how sensitive this kind of information is, published a companion ethics paper laying out strict guidelines for how any of this information could ever be shared with individual living relatives: full consent, careful communication, and no unsolicited contact. This wasn't just a scientific discovery. It became a live, ongoing question about identity, consent, and what people are owed when science can suddenly answer questions their own family history never could. Here's a question worth sitting with and worth answering honestly in the comments. If a lab could tell you with certainty that you were one of those 41,799 people, would you want to know? Not everyone says yes, and that's worth talking about too. Now we have a location, we have living descendants, which raises the obvious question the entire investigation has been building toward. Why did nobody know any of this until 2023? Why were these connections erased from paper in the first place? To understand why DNA had to do the job that paperwork should have done, you have to understand how thoroughly the system of American slavery was built to prevent exactly this kind of identity from surviving. This wasn't simply neglect or an accident of history where records were lost in a fire somewhere. It was structural. Enslaved people in the United States were legally classified as property, not as people with recognized family relationships. Marriages between enslaved individuals had no legal standing in most of the country, which meant there was no legal requirement to record them. Family separations through sale were common and often deliberate. Parents sold away from children, siblings sold to different states, with no obligation on anyone's part to preserve or even acknowledge the connection. Enslaved people were frequently denied the right to choose their own surnames and were often recorded, if recorded at all, only by a first name alongside an owner's property inventory, listed in the same documents as livestock, tools, and furniture. Literacy was criminalized for enslaved people across large parts of the South, which meant even informal personal record-keeping, letters, journals, family Bibles with handwritten lineage pages, the tools many other American families used to preserve their history, were often simply unavailable to them. And then there is the 1870 census, the wall we mentioned earlier, the first federal count to list Black Americans as individuals by name, rather than as anonymous entries under a slaveholder's household. Everything before that line, for the overwhelming majority of African American families, exists in a kind of historical fog, not because those ancestors didn't matter, and not because nobody tried to remember them, but because the legal and social system of the time was structured at almost every level to prevent that memory from being formally recorded and preserved. This is not a fringe historical interpretation. It is the mainstream, well-documented consensus of historians of American slavery, genealogists, and archivists who have spent careers trying to work around exactly this gap. So when the paper trail goes cold, it doesn't mean the ancestors didn't exist or that their story is unknowable. It means the story was never allowed onto paper in the first place. And that is precisely the gap that this DNA study managed to step into, not by finding a hidden document somewhere in an archive, but by reading information that was never written on paper at all, because it didn't need to be. It was stored into the genome and passed down generation after generation, completely independent of any ledger, any deed, any court record, immune to fire, immune to a slaveholder's decision not to write a name down, immune to the entire legal apparatus that was built to keep enslaved families undocumented. That is the twist at the center of this entire case. The identity that history books say was lost at the slave ship was never actually lost. It was simply stored somewhere the old records could never reach. So what does it actually mean that this gap can now be closed, at least partially, with genetic science? For the descendant communities connected to Catoctin Furnace, it means something concrete. Two local organizations, the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society and the African American Resources, Cultural, and Heritage Society of Frederick County, had already spent years trying to piece together who these individuals were, using every genealogical and archival tool available. The DNA study gave them something those tools alone could never provide: a direct, physical, biological thread connecting the 27 people in that cemetery to specific regions in Senegambia and Central Africa, and to tens of thousands of living relatives, some of whom may still live in the same county. The historical narrative that many people grew up with treats the slave ship as a hard boundary, a point past which identity simply cannot be recovered, a line drawn once and considered permanent. What this research demonstrates, carefully, methodically, and with published, peer-reviewed evidence, is that the boundary was never as absolute as it appeared on paper. The identity wasn't destroyed. It was inherited, silently, in the genome of every generation that followed, waiting for a method precise enough and patient enough to read it back out. Before we close, this is exactly the kind of case where reasonable people can disagree on what should happen next. Should living relatives be proactively contacted, or is it better, as this research team decided, to let people come forward on their own terms? There's no single right answer, and the comment section is the place to make yours. 27 graves, 2 continents of origin, 41,799 living relatives, one number on one screen in one Harvard lab in 2023. The bloodline that history said was severed at the ship was never actually gone. It was simply waiting, in bone, in blood, in the quiet architecture of the genome, for someone to finally know how to ask it the right question. If this investigation changed how you think about what lost history actually means, subscribe for the next case file. And if you've got a family story that stops cold before the 1870s, you already know exactly what to write in the comments.